welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about the role that franchised businesses play in Canada's economy. June 11th is World Franchise Day, and while many of us may not think about franchises, they're actually a part of the fabric of our daily lives. From where you grab your morning coffee, fill up your car with gas, buy your makeup and prescriptions, to your home hardware and home goods, franchising is a huge part of Canada's economy. It is Canada's 12th largest industry and contributed $133 billion and 2 million jobs to our country's economy last year. But being a part of this entrepreneurial business model comes with its own unique and surprising legal issues. What should we know about this business model that is so ingrained in our lives? And what does it take to run a successful franchise? Here today to discuss this is somebody who thinks about franchises on a daily basis, lawyer Jen Shako of the law firm Aird and Burles. Jen, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so thrilled to talk to you about this. First, I talked a little bit in the beginning about the types of businesses that make up the franchising industry, but maybe you can expand on the breadth of this industry and how ingrained it is in Canada's economy.
Thanks, Christine. Franchising touches so many different industries that you wouldn't even think of in your day to day life. So, some of the industries that you may not have thought about before are hotels. Most hotels are franchises, senior care. So, this is care for seniors in their home or outside of their home. Home service industries. So, whether that's repair, restoration, or renovation. Tutoring services. There's lots of different types of tutoring services for children or adults. Those are almost always franchises. Commercial cleaning. Commercial cleaning, there's lots of franchises in that space, as well as the janitorial space, automotive dealerships, automotive parts. The list really goes on, and there's over 50 industries that franchising touches and growing.
Wow. So, we've been talking about franchises like everybody knows what those are. I think we all intuitively have an understanding of an example of a franchise. Most Canadians probably think of Tim Hortons, but I know there is a technical legal definition of what makes something a franchise. It's defined through law and regulation and in agreements. So, what is it technically, legally speaking, that makes something a franchise?
Question. So, the definition of franchise under the Ontario legislation, which is called the Arthur Wishart Act, is very, very broad. And this definition is similar across other provinces in Canada that also have franchise legislation. So, it actually captures a lot more business relationships than you would think. But the hallmark of what makes something a franchise is that one, there would need to be some kind of license or grant being given by the franchisor to a franchisee. Two, there needs to be some kind of payment that is being made, whether that's a continuing payment or a one time payment by the franchisee back to the franchisor. And number three is that the franchisor must have some kind of significant control over the franchisee's operations, or the franchisor can provide the franchisee with significant assistance.
That
And
adds a lot of
although
clarity. Yeah. I'm curious, what are some of the advantages of this business model? Why would a business choose to expand as a franchise instead of just having multiple locations of one corporation?
Yeah, so franchising as a business model makes a lot of sense for franchisors that want to expand and grow their brand and grow, obviously, their consumer base, but without having to spend their own capital. So that is one major advantage of the franchising model. Another big advantage of franchising is that you get to work with a local operator, someone in that market who knows their community, who knows the people in that community, and has a good sense on the ground of what that specific community or region may be looking for. So you get that local expertise from someone local. And also, you get someone who's very motivated,
Hmm.
someone who has an entrepreneurial spirit and wants to really get in the business, roll
Right,
up their sleeves,
right.
and really
We've
dedicate themselves
we've got to
to
go to
that
break.
business.
We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking with Jen Shako, a franchise lawyer and expert in the franchising business model. In the last segment, we were talking about the advantages of a business becoming a franchise, why someone might want to franchise their business. But what about the other side of that business model, Jen? If you want to start your own business, if you want to become an entrepreneur, why would buying a franchise be a good option?
So, franchising is very attractive for small business owners because it gives them the chance to operate something that has a proven system. And typically, there will be some goodwill that has been built up in that specific brand or trademark or trade name. So, even though they have their own business, they're getting into a larger network and they're getting the benefits of that experience from that larger network that's more established.
And what does it take? What do you think it takes to become a successful franchisee? You know, if you want to succeed in this, do you have any tips for people who want to get into this?
Yeah, it's very similar to owning your own business in the sense that it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of determination, and it takes a lot of grit. But what's different about getting a franchise business is you need to follow the system as a franchisee. So you get the benefit of a system. And on the other side of that is that you need to follow it. So to ensure the consistency of that business.
Yeah, so that we talked about that a little bit in the last segment about, the definition you gave of what is a franchise. But, I understand there are obligations on both sides. There are obligations by the franchisor to the local entrepreneur, and then that local entrepreneur has their own obligations. So, can you give me some examples of typical obligations that a franchise owner, the local operated business, might have to the larger corporation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the local owner will have to undergo vigorous training so that they can learn how to execute the franchised system and the business of that system. So the training will typically be on the method of operation. And following that training period, it's really for that local owner to adhere to the brand standards that will be enforced by the franchisor. So when you go into one location in Toronto versus another location in Yellowknife, you would expect the same coffee or the same type of service. So it's really that hallmark of consistency that both sides are trying to get at.
And what about on the other side? What obligations does the large corporation, the franchisor, have to the local businesses?
So franchisors need to stay competitive in a rapidly evolving marketplace. And so it's the franchisor's duty to modernize and innovate and kind of make sure that they're keeping with the pulse of that particular industry and then to roll out whatever changes or updates across the system. It's also the franchisor's duty to enforce the standards because that's how you get consistency. So franchisors are very active in trying to enforce those system standards or brand standards across their network.
So, when we talk about obligations that one side has to another, one of my big questions is what happens when there's a disagreement? What are some typical disputes that you see as a franchise lawyer? What are the main legal issues that come up in this business model that require sometimes even litigation?
Yes, so disputes are inevitable, especially between two different business partners. And there's lots of different litigation that does come up in the franchising context. But there is quite a bit of disagreement that can come up when there's ever a system change. So it's very hard for anyone to accept change. And you may know, like, you like doing something a certain way, or you might like selling a certain product. So where the franchisor is actually trying to, modernize, update, keep the system fresh, the rollout of those system changes may be very difficult on some franchisees or the network. Or let's say if you're changing your staffing model, if you're going from, a partial operating hours to 24 hours of operation, those kind of system changes can be very difficult to implement, both on the franchisor side, and then the acceptance of those changes by the franchisee can also be very difficult.
Wow, so it's super interesting. I imagine with so many businesses that use this model, the sort of possibility of types of disputes is endless. But luckily, there are great lawyers like you to help in those situations. We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the massive role that the franchise industry plays in Canada's economy. And we're joined by franchise expert and lawyer Jen Shako of Airden Burles. Now, Jen, I'm sure that there are all kinds of business challenges that franchises face. And I think in the last 5 years, every business was faced with challenges uniquely presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. But I know that that was especially devastating to the restaurant industry, which is a heavily franchised industry. What can you tell me about the effect that the pandemic and pandemic related restrictions had on the industry, if it's still being felt? And if there's any additional fallout, litigation still related to those measures.
Yes, COVID was a challenge for most of us. And in the restaurant industry in particular, with the changes which could fluctuate week by week and sometimes day by day on the government regulations on whether or not restaurants and other establishments were allowed to be open, were allowed to serve how many guests, the number of guests that were allowed to sit at one table, the social distancing measures that were put into place and which changed very dramatically from one day to another. It was very difficult for many restaurants, and I would say most restaurants, to operate in those very unpredictable times where they have never dealt with anything like that in this generation, at least, where you really didn't know what was happening the next day. And from a staffing perspective, I will say that there was a lot of uncertainty with staff and would you have enough labor? Would you have enough people to work in the restaurants with the constant opening and closures?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about COVID as being this era of uncertainty where things changed day to day, and that certainly was true. But we're dealing with that again now in a totally different context, in an economic context, where tariffs imposed by the US administration of Donald Trump seem to change day by day. So, what impact are tariffs or the threat of tariffs or the repeal of tariffs or just the ever changing trade and supply management or supply chain management system, how is that all impacting the franchise industry as well?
Has a huge impact on the franchise industry across various franchises, whether or not those are restaurants or hotels or pet stores or what have you. I think that tariffs impacts all of us living in Canada at least. And what we're seeing is that consumer spending as a whole is very low. And that's having a big impact on all different kinds of businesses. So that is a very challenging environment for people to operate in. But as well as on the consumer side, there's been a made in Canada movement, which is fantastic in the sense that, we're all very proud to be Canadian, and most franchises are owned by small business owners that are all Canadian. But due to various supplies going back and forth across Canada and the US, it can be very challenging for the supply chain and getting all of the components you need, whether that's components in a hamburger or components in a car. So this has quite a profound impact on not only consumer spending, but on supply chain and the availability of certain products and services.
Yeah, I mean, the tariffs are having a massive impact on Canada's economy. more broadly, but when you have, certain obligations to have certain products because of your franchise agreement, I can imagine, or certain staffing requirements because of your franchise agreement, and maybe people aren't available. These are things that are really unique challenges to this particular industry, which, as I said in the opener, is a massive industry. Yet, how what is the value of the franchise industry in Canada, John?
So franchising is actually huge and it's often overlooked for whatever reason. But franchising is Canada's 12th largest industry and employs almost 2 million people and growing. So the projected growth of the franchise industry, even during these turbulent times, is approximately 4%, with the majority of that growth happening in Ontario. So it's a very important industry in terms of the contribution it makes to employment and to the tax revenue as well.
Yeah, really fascinating. We've got to go to commercial break now, but when we come back, I kind of want to expand on that idea that you just brought up about the future of this industry and where franchising we expect it might go in 2026. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the enormous and often undiscussed role that the franchise industry has in Canada's economy. And we're joined by lawyer Jen Shako from Airden Burles. Now, Jen, in the last segment, you were talking about there seems to be growth in this business model. It seems like more and more businesses are opting to expand as franchises or become franchises. Why do you think that's the case? Why do you see this growth as something that's so desirable?
There's a little bit more certainty in being part of a larger network. So, from a small business owner perspective, being part of a franchise, having an established brand, having a proven system, that gives you a little bit more confidence than just trying to do something independently or creating something new on your own. And then on the flip side of that, for franchisors, or for companies looking to franchise, it's a really great way to get your brand out there. It's a really great way to utilize someone else's capital, especially in this current climate where interest rates are higher than they historically have been. And it's also just a great way to get into new markets and work with someone local who has that expertise. So there's several advantages of franchising, which I would say is making this business model more and more popular in Canada.
So where do you see this business model going in the future? They're kind of like new cutting edge developments in how businesses are structuring themselves as franchises, particularly as technology expands. What do you see as the future for franchising as a business model?
Yeah, so one of the areas of new franchising and new growth is in the construction industry. So from 2025 to 2026, in terms of this specific industry, there's supposed to be a growth of almost 4% in franchise related nominal GDP related to construction.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of different construction companies that do all kinds of work. But if you think about with respect to your own home, there is a growth in home repair franchises, home renovation franchises, home restoration franchises. So if you think about if there's been a flood or a fire, so this is one of the areas where we're seeing one of the most largest growth by franchise industry is in the construction industry.
Well, it's so fascinating because I never would have thought of that as an industry that is franchised. So it's so interesting to learn that. Jen, I have to say your career is a fascinating one to me. I just had no idea when I started law school that that was a career path that was available. How was it that you decided that this was what you were going to focus your career on, and sort of what motivated you to make that selection?
I love franchising. I fell into it, but I like how nuanced this particular industry is because although it's a corporate practice, a corporate commercial practice, there's a lot that can happen between two parties that have worked together for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So there's quite a lot of stories that come out of franchise law and franchise litigation. And I find it really interesting to deal with two commercial parties that are kind of working together, but for themselves. And it's very interesting to see the evolution of this industry in Canada because Canada is becoming more and more evolved in this particular industry.
Yeah, and it's so amazing to work with entrepreneurs. And these are, both sides of the equation are entrepreneurs in totally different ways. So, Jen, this was an amazing conversation. I really learned so much about this industry that I didn't know before. And, next time I go about my day, I might just count how many businesses I go into that are actually franchises because I really had no idea going into this conversation how big an impact they actually have on my day to day life and the day to day lives of all of us. So, thank you so much for joining us for this fascinating conversation.
Thanks, Christine, and happy World Franchise Day on Wednesday, June 11th.
Thank you. We've heard today about the role that franchises play in Canada's economy and some of the laws and regulations governing this business model. Have you ever wanted to get into the franchise business? What do you think it would take to succeed? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.